Over the last 9 millennia, people have made beer out of rice, berries, barley, wheat, hops, corn, honey, and even bananas. Join me today on Footnoting History as I skim over the fascinating history of beer from its origins to the present day. Hello and welcome to Footnoting History. I'm your host Sam, and I'll be talking to you about the history of beer. If you like this episode, please visit our website www.footnotinghistory.com to learn more about our team and about how you can support our work. My story starts in 1953, when Robert Braidwood organized an archaeological conference where he proposed a novel theory that early grain cultivation may have been intended to produce beer rather than to bake bread, as had previously been assumed. Historians and archaeologists are still debating whether hunger or thirst was the stronger motivator in the process of crop domestication. The matter will probably never be definitively settled. The truth is, it's difficult to differentiate between bread making and beer making using the archaeological record because you need pretty much the same things to brew and to bake bread. The existence of a lot of drinking vessels and larger containers for liquids might indicate the drink was part of the equation, but people might also have been using pottery to transport and consume water. One thing is really clear though, beer production has a very long history. Before I go any further, I should talk for just a moment about definitions. In my very first episode of Footnoting History, I talked about the history of taverns in the Middle Ages. And in that episode, I made a point of distinguishing between beer, which is made with hops, and ale, which is not. This distinction was appropriate when focusing on the Middle Ages. However, historians who look at a longer period of time typically adopt a broader definition of beer. While modern beer is made with hops, ancient varieties could be made with any kind of grain. What really distinguishes ancient beers is their alcohol content and the methods used to make them. Historical beers were typically, though not always, made from cereals that were converted into sugars through a process of germination, fermentation, or salivation. Yeah, you heard me right. Some early grains were prepared for brewing by chewing them and using the saliva to help break down grains into sugars that could then be converted into alcohol. For the purposes of today's episode, I will be adopting the broadest possible definition of beer, though towards the end of the episode, I will sometimes make a distinction between modern and ancient varieties. The earliest definitive evidence for beer brewing can be found in China roughly 9,000 years ago. Residue in pots from the village of Jiahu demonstrate that people were making beer from rice, grapes, hawthorn fruit, and honey. This beer would not have been very much like our modern drink. Not only was it made with different ingredients, but it also had a thicker consistency, so it would have been more like a lightly alcoholic gruel than a true beverage. One anthropologist has suggested that early beer may have been similar to Hawaiian poi in texture. There is substantial evidence that people frequently drank beer through straws, which would simultaneously have filtered out some of the debris from the brewing process and would have allowed the drinker to feel the effect of the alcohol faster. While the straws themselves were often made out of natural fibers that have biodegraded over the years, they did sometimes make use of copper or alloy straw tips that have survived from the late Bronze Age onward. Our earliest evidence for winemaking came about 3,600 years later in modern-day Iran, and that's just because wine is a little bit harder to make than beer. But even as people were starting to make wine, the residual calcium oxalate found in some surviving jugs demonstrate that people continued to brew barley beer even when other intoxicants were available. Indeed, according to a Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, drinking beer makes the liver happy and fills the heart with joy. So while modern audiences tend to perceive wine as the upscale preferable beverage, it's not entirely clear that ancient consumers would have preferred one product over the other. There is more surviving evidence of wine consumption than for beer consumption because it's somewhat easier to detect wine than beer. This ease of detection stems in part from the fact that wine is stable for a longer period of time than beer. Therefore, wine was more likely to be stored for an extended duration and consequently to leave residue that can be picked up by modern technology. Because of this stability, wine was also more likely to be traded over long distance and therefore to appear in written records. That does not mean, however, that wine was consumed more frequently or esteemed more highly than beer. In Egypt, beer was an essential food and was consumed by all social classes. Egyptians used it to pay workers and stored beer in pharaohs' tombs for the pharaohs to drink following their resurrections. Egyptians also saw beer as medicinal. They used it to disinfect wounds and combined it with other ingredients to make enemas to alleviate anal discomfort. Beer brewing was not confined to the Old World. Corn was being cultivated in the Americas over 8,000 years ago, and recent evidence suggests that domesticated corn was likely used to make fermented drinks. The earliest clear evidence of beer production in the Western Hemisphere dates from about 1400 years ago. There's a ceremonial site in the Andes Mountains known as Sarabul where giant vats were used to make beer out of spicy berries. Archaeologists estimate that around 1,800 liters of beer were produced in each batch. They've also identified drinking vessels of various sizes at the site, which suggests that beer may have been distributed in unequal measures that may have reflected the political or social status of the consumers. While much of the early history of beer is speculative, there are some historians and archaeologists who perceive a connection between the rise of beer production and the formation of organized states. The logic here is that the organization required to produce beer, which included growing grain and sending it through a labor-intensive process of fermentation, required a high level of organization. Of course, the same thing could be argued for bread production. It's pretty clear that grain production was comparatively easily measured and taxed regardless of whether it was being used for porridge, bread, or beer. After beer was produced, it was more than a simple source of nutrition. It was also an economic commodity and a marker of social status. Unlike other grain-based foods, beer was also a social lubricant. Even if a state was not needed to produce beer, the existence of beer may have helped to solidify social hierarchies and to form economic relationships, and even to produce political power. Beer has also been used for ceremonial and religious purposes. The Inca, for example, used chicha beer in their rituals, and in their annual bear festival, the Ainu of Japan used beer to symbolize their connection to their ancestors. When there are documentary sources that tell us who was responsible for brewing, it is most often women who were associated with making beer. And even before we have evidence about who was brewing, women were frequently associated with beer. For example, while most Mesopotamian craft gods were male, the beer deity was female. To a degree, the association between women and brewing makes sense, given that brewing can be done domestically and that it requires many hours of labor using a lot of the same equipment as cooking. It's unsurprising, therefore, that women, who have often been responsible for household tasks, including cooking, would also be responsible for brewing. This pattern is still prevalent in regions where brewing is done on a small scale, notably in sub-Saharan Africa. But in modern Europe and in the United States, brewing is most often associated with men. How can we explain that difference? Judith Bennett has proposed that men began to take over the process of brewing in the 14th and 15th centuries. Beer can be made with any number of grains and can be produced on a small scale with very limited equipment. At a minimum, what you need is a fire and a large pot. Ideally, you would also want to strain the grain away from the liquid, but that step of the process can be dispensed with. And in fact, there's ample evidence that in the medieval period, people were still frequently drinking beer that was thickened with grain. This would also have increased its nutritional value. In the mid-14th century, a few things started to change in the production of beer. First off, people started consuming more of it. There are some historians who suspect that beer may have accounted for as much as half of the calories consumed in some parts of England by the end of the 14th century. The second major change here is that hops were increasingly introduced to the brewing process. Hops were first popularized in Holland and then spread throughout the Low Countries, Germany, Scandinavia, and England. This change was more significant than it sounds because in addition to changing the flavor of beer, the introduction of hops also made it possible to brew stronger batches that would remain stable for longer periods of time. Before this shift, beer, or ale, only lasted for a few days or a week before it started to sour and go bad. Therefore, it had to be produced in small batches and traded on a small scale. As a result, there were legions of wives who were responsible for producing beer and for selling it from their homes or even on the street. Once hops were introduced to the process, however, it became possible to produce larger quantities of beer and effectively to commercialize the process of making and selling it. As that happened, people began to view brewing as a profession rather than as a side hustle. Guilds began to form to protect the trade and to guard its secrets. Large breweries began to open up and to compete with each other, and according to Bennett, when beer production came to be viewed as a respectable craft, men increasingly came to dominate the trade and women were forced out. This process took time, and it wasn't until the end of the 16th century that brewing was predominantly seen as a masculine profession in Western Europe. The idea that men tend to take over fields that are viewed as professional or that have more earning potential while women are relegated to domestic tasks and less profitable careers remains true today, and explains why in the United States women only earn 80 cents for every dollar that men earn. The dawn of the modern period also witnessed increasing concerns about drunkenness. A brilliant study by Marjorie McIntosh shows that indictments for drunkenness began to increase dramatically in the 15th and 16th centuries. Yet, while contemporaries were concerned about drunkenness, moralists did not seek to criminalize all alcohol consumption. Instead, they argued for moderation and tried to prescribe the manner and context in which people should be drinking. In spite of moral and legal condemnation of drunkenness, levels of alcohol consumption increased over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. In London alone, people were drinking an estimated 51 million liters of beer every week in 1574. By 1600, Londoners imbibed nearly 3 times as much beer each week. In thinking about these numbers, we need to remember that the population of London was growing, though not as fast as the consumption of beer, and that beer was still an essential source of nourishment. But drinking was not just about caloric intake. Intoxicants were also closely tied to social identities. While historians used to speculate that increasing consumption of beer may have served as a means of escape from the deteriorating living conditions among the poor, consumption of the elite was actually rising more rapidly than consumption among the poor due to rising real incomes among the merchant and gentry classes. Even as the use of mild intoxicants, including coffee, tea, and tobacco, became integral to an emerging culture of respectability, alcohol consumption and drunkenness remained an essential component of elite culture, especially within the context of guilds, elite societies, and universities. Indeed, in 1628, William Prynne observed that men who did not drink were not just sober, they were unsociable. A man who abstained from drink was, quote, branded for a Puritan and a hypocrite, even by such who deemed him an honest man, a sociable boon, and a good companion heretofore, end quote. And yet Prynne also warned that intoxication, quote, excludes and shuts out men from heaven, end quote. Here, I think we can really see the tension between the need to drink to be sociable and the very real moral qualms about drunkenness. In his analysis of the culture of intoxication in the 17th century, Phil Withington has argued that historians are wrong to blame the poor for the emerging culture of drunkenness. From Withington's perspective, condemnation of drinking among the poor stemmed from prejudice against poor people. In his view, England's chronic drunkenness was a product of elite culture and the emulation of it. It's hard to say whether or not this argument is right, but I think it's worth considering, especially given how prone our surviving sources are to prejudice against the poor and otherwise marginalized groups. In any case, consumption of both beer and wine seems to have peaked in the 1620s and 1630s and decreased somewhat thereafter. It would increase again in the 18th century, but by then distilled liquors were beginning to displace beer as the preferred alcoholic beverage. The rise of distilled liquors increased concerns about drunkenness and stimulated arguments in favor of abstinence. Even in what is now Germany, where beer brewing had been a major part of the economy in the 16th and 17th centuries, beer brewing lost its status as the most popular beverage in the 18th century as coffee and tea grew in popularity and as peasants and artisans increasingly turned to hard liquor. But again, drinking is not just about calories or intoxication, it's also determined by cultural factors. After the Napoleonic Wars, drinking beer became an essential component of the emerging nationalist German identity. Following from Tacitus, 19th century thinkers began to associate consumption of beer, as opposed to consumption of wine, as one of the factors that differentiated the Germans from their neighbors. Though I will also remind you at this juncture that plenty of beer was imbibed in pre-modern France, Belgium, and England. Following the Napoleonic Wars, increasing nationalism, along with the development of new brewing techniques in Bavaria, increased the popularity of beer in Germany and of German beer internationally. By the end of the 19th century, beer was once again the most popular drink in Germany, though admittedly, part of that popularity stemmed from alco-tourism. People still travel to Bavaria every year to celebrate Oktoberfest. Western-style beer made of barley and hops was also exported through the rest of the world in the age of imperialism. When Matthew Perry presented the Japanese with American beer in 1854, one dignitary recorded that it tasted like bitter horse piss. But it caught on nonetheless. By the 1950s, Western beer had become the most popular alcoholic beverage in Japan. The Japanese took to European-style beer more readily than any other non-Western nation, in part because they viewed adoption of Western culture as a necessary component of advancement. The shift from sake to beer was also facilitated by the rationing of rice during the Second World War. Limitations in usage of rice effectively halted sake production and fostered a taste for Western beer, especially among the troops. This new preference survived after the war. During the age of imperialism, European beer was introduced throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. European attitudes to the spread of beer culture varied. While British colonial officials attempted to maintain beer as a beverage exclusively for Europeans, the Germans encouraged the growth of beer markets abroad. This difference can perhaps be explained at least in part by the fact that the Germans were exporting a lot more beer than the Brits and stood to profit from expanding markets. Indeed, German beer production was so popular that when the Japanese occupied Qingdao during World War I, they brought the local German brewmaster back home with them to help improve their own production methods. As they expanded, the Japanese extended beer markets into Korea, Taiwan, and Manchuria. After the Japanese were driven out of these regions, beer production was largely taken over by national interests. Thereafter, local production focused on use of regional ingredients and methods. By the time of the Communist Revolution in China, Western-style beer was perceived to be Chinese enough that it survived the Cultural Revolution. One place where profusion of Western-style beer was less effective was in India, where beer was largely associated with the history of imperialism and where alcohol consumption is strongly discouraged by both Hindu and Muslim culture. To this day, the informal pubs in India that serve beer tend to be found in places serving an international audience and tend to lean into nostalgia for imperialism, sometimes even flying Union Jacks. The other worldwide trend that we can look to is the rise of macrobreweries. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the international beer industry experienced a phase of consolidation and homogenization. As a result, the number of independent breweries fell. In Belgium, for example, there were more than 3,000 breweries in 1900 and only 143 in 1980. Over the same period of time, the number of independent breweries in the UK fell from over 1,400 to fewer than 200. There were a lot of reasons for this shift. Partially, it was a result of technological innovation, which benefited bigger producers and allowed them to profit from greater economies of scale. Similarly, increasing advertising advantaged brewers with more spending power. Over time, global mergers and acquisitions led to the consolidation of the brewing industry. As that happened, macro brewers re-engineered their products to appeal to as many consumers as possible, which resulted in milder, more homogeneous beers. The number of independent breweries hit a low point in the 1980s, but since then, the number of breweries has been increasing with the growing popularity of craft beers, which has been stimulated in part by increasing interest in local products, by concerns about the environmental impact of transporting consumer goods, and by a willingness of investors to back new microbreweries. Since the 1980s, the number of breweries in the United States and in Europe has increased on a per capita basis. Nowhere has this increase been more noticeable than in the United States, where there are 50 times as many breweries now than there were in 1980. And I guess that takes us up to the present and out of the realm of history, so my job here is done. If you liked this episode of Footnoting History, please visit our website, www.footnotinghistory.com, where you can find more resources related to this episode and more information about our podcast. Until next time, remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.